And according to the American Civil Liberties Union, the United States comprises just 5% of the world population, but is home to 25% of the world's prison population, making America the world's largest jailer. U.S. President Barack Obama is trying to change that statistic by using his executive clemency power to commute the sentences of nonviolent drug offenders. For decades, mandatory minimum laws have bloated U.S. prisons. In his book, 15 to Life, How I Painted My Way to Freedom, Anthony Papa describes how discovering art while in prison changed his life and led to his clemency. He is also the media relations manager for the Drug Policy Alliance, who supports the president's decision, and he's right here in our New York studios. Anthony, nice to meet you, and welcome to Arise America.
Thank you for having me on.
So glad to have you here. I guess the first question to ask is, what's your reaction to these announced plans by Attorney General Eric Holder and President Obama to extend this clemency to a greater population in federal prisons?
It's a very welcome move, and I hope it helps to right the wrongs of a broken criminal justice system.
Now, what do you mean by a broken system?
Well, the mandatory minimum sentencing, which the war on drugs dictates, has found a way to break the system by incarcerating many low-level, nonviolent drug offenders. So this move by President Obama shows he's concerned of the injustice that was dished out in other administrations, and he's trying to fix a broken system.
And the reality here, though, this really only deals with federal prisons, doesn't deal with states. So what's your hope there, that this might perhaps set a trend?
Right, and we're hoping that because President Obama has stepped up to the plate, that governors of states will follow and exercise their clemency powers to use them more to grant people their freedom.
And the reality is, and we don't have time to go through all of these recommendations, the guidelines for clemency, but it has to do with inmates that have served at least 10 years.
Right.
If I believe they have to have, it has to be a nonviolent offense, and so it's a very focused and very narrow group that this applies to. Do you feel like they went far enough with this effort?
Well, I think for the point they're trying to make, you know, they did go far in regards to granting clemency to hundreds, maybe thousands of people. Maybe they're trying the waters out, the first steps, and maybe they'll extend it to a different population when these people come out and they see that they effectively interact with society and become tax-paying citizens and productive citizens. Maybe it'll extend to a further population and affect more people. And
if you will, Anthony, make the argument for the motivation for it extending to a wider population, because I think politically, a lot of politicians, elected officials are very reluctant. Everybody harkens back to Michael Dukakis and Willie Horton, which derailed his political career, and that is the fear of letting someone out of incarceration and then they go out and do something harmful in society.
Well, I'll use myself for an example. I was a first-time nonviolent drug offender. I was sentenced to 2 15 to life sentences under the Rockefeller drug laws of New York State, which mandates mandatory minimum sentencing. The judge, in my case, didn't want to sentence me to 15 to life, but he had to because of mandatory minimum sentencing laws. And I think that there's many people stuck in prison that have fell through the cracks of the criminal justice system with no relief other than getting clemency or from the President of the United States or governors of the states they're in. So there are many men and women that deserve second chances in their life, and they're really they're fully rehabilitated, but they're stuck in prison with no alternatives.
Before I let you go, I want to get you to react to the Smarter Sentencing Act, which is being reviewed by the Senate Judiciary Committee, which would be something beyond what the president can do with his executive powers. Tell me what you think about it.
Well, I think it's great bipartisan legislation. I think it goes far in regards to giving judges the power to look at the totality of facts and cases. It overthrows mandatory minimum sentencing, and the crack cocaine disparity in 2010 that Obama signed into legislation, which let thousands of people go. About 5,000 or 6,000 people are still stuck there. So this would, if applied, would apply retroactively and help those people get out also. So all around, it's a great piece of legislation, and hopefully it's going to pass. And I I pray President Obama grants these people those clemencies and they return home to their families and reunite with their loved ones.
Anthony Papa, thank you very much for coming on. Congratulations on all your success.
Thanks so much.
Appreciate it. Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
And this is Arise America.
This afternoon, the Senate Judiciary Committee is holding a hearing on what's being called the most historic criminal justice reform proposal in decades. The measure would reduce mandatory minimum sentences for nonviolent drug offenders while also increasing mandatory minimum sentences for other offenses, including interstate domestic violence. It would also ban solitary confinement for juveniles and bolster rehab programs for some inmates. The hearing comes amid growing momentum for sweeping criminal justice reform, including a major push by President Obama, who touted the Senate bill during his weekly address.
And I'm encouraged by these kinds of bipartisan efforts. It's real progress. Not liberal ideas or conservative ideas, but common sense solutions to the challenges we face. We pledge allegiance to one nation under God, with liberty and justice for all. Justice means that every child deserves a chance to grow up safe and secure without the threat of violence. Justice means that the punishment should fit the crime. And justice means allowing our fellow Americans who've made mistakes to pay their debt to society.
Well, the bill is being backed by key leaders on both parties, and a similar measure is also making its way through the House. MSNBC chief legal correspondent Ari Melber is joining me now. Also joining us is Anthony Papa with the Drug Policy Alliance. Anthony spent a dozen years in a state prison for a nonviolent drug offense and is now an advocate against the so-called war on drugs. So, guys, it's good to have you here. First to you, Ari, can you explain just how significant this would be if this gets signed into law?
If this were signed into law, as you just mentioned, it would be, Alex, one of the largest changes to federal prison enforcement and sentencing in a generation, especially, as we know, in a period where we've seen the war on drugs rely on these harsh sentences for drug sentencing throughout the system. I want to bring in Anthony Papa, who's here. We've spoken to policymakers today about this. We're speaking to you as someone who's been through it in New York. Tell us about your story.
Well, I was a first-time nonviolent offender. In 1985, made the biggest mistake of my life. Got involved with drug activity. I passed an envelope with 4.5 ounces of cocaine to undercover officers for the sum of $500. For that, I made every mistake you can make, and I wound up going to prison. I was sentenced to 15 years to life. While in prison, I didn't...
Now, on that point, so was that your first offense?
First-time nonviolent drug offender.
So you're really
before.
an example of what people talk about in this, where your first time in the criminal justice system, no gun, no violence,
Nothing.
right? And you got 15 to life.
Yes, 15 to life. It was a nightmare experience for me. And while I was in prison, I took advantage of the rehabilitative programs, got 3 college degrees, discovered my talent as an artist. One night I was sitting in my cell, picked up a mirror, looked in the mirror, saw an individual who's going to spend the most productive years of life in a cage, painted the self-portrait, 15 to life. 7 years later, wound up at the Whitney Museum of American Art. I got a lot of publicity on my case. I came out. But that's when the story begins, because then I wanted to save those left behind, so I started being an advocate. Against the strict mandatory minimum sentencing laws.
And your case changed in part because George Pataki, the governor of New York, did intervene, right?
Right, he granted me executive clemency.
He was considered a moderate Republican. I want to play some sound from a conservative Republican we interviewed just this morning who's also backing this bill, Senator Mike Lee. Let's listen to that.
Certainly one can point to the fact that it costs about $30,000 a year to put somebody in federal prison, and that is a consideration. But, it's my view and the view of most of the people working on the bill that the biggest costs that we're worried about here are not just the financial ones, but the human costs. The fact that we've got husbands and fathers and uncles and nephews and husbands who are locked up sometimes for years or even decades at a time. In many instances, locked up much longer than they need to be locked up in order to protect the public and serve the interest of justice.
What does it mean to you to hear a Tea Party Republican there talking about kind of your situation, family members locked away for what he says is too long?
I think it's fantastic. I think it's a first good step. We need more to be done. But to do away with mandatory minimum sentencing, it's a great move. It's going to save a lot of lives, people returning to society who are ready to return as citizens.
And the last thing I just want to ask you briefly is, what do you say to young people who look at your story, or people who don't have hope and are worried about all these problems? What do you say with everything you've been through?
I say people make mistakes in their lives and they need second chances. So President Obama, my hat is off to him for trying to do away with mass incarceration, and I hope people follow the steps that are going to reform these laws and help people to come home to return to their families.
Right, which you were able to do, but after a long struggle and journey. Anthony Papa, thank you for sharing your story with us today.
Thank you so much.
Back to you.
Yeah, you know what I like about that? Look at Anthony. He went and got a college education a couple of times over. I mean, good for you for doing the most you could during your time there in prison. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for that discussion.
The president is doing something no other sitting president has done before. He will visit a federal prison. It's a medium security correctional facility just outside of Oklahoma City. In addition to taking a tour, the president is also expected to meet with inmates and law enforcement officials. And this comes just days after a decision by the White House to commute the prison sentences of dozens of drug offenders. Reforming the criminal justice system is something the president says he wants to make a top priority during his remaining time in office. With me now to talk about all of this, the author of 15 to Life, How I Painted My Way to Freedom, Anthony Papa. He was locked up after being busted for delivering an envelope containing 4 ounces of cocaine worth about $500. He served 12 years, and his sentence was eventually granted executive clemency by then Governor George Pataki. Welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me here.
So briefly touch on your story. You're busted for carrying $500 worth of cocaine, and you're sentenced to how long?
Well, I got 2 15 to life terms, first-time nonviolent drug offender, under the Rockefeller drug laws of New York State, which mandate mandatory minimum sentencing laws, something that the president wants to reform. And I think it's a great idea because many, many people are in prison serving 15, 20, 25 years for small amounts of drugs, and they're rotting away in the system.
Now, were you going to sell the drugs, take the drugs?
I was a courier. I passed an envelope. It was first-time nonviolent drug offender. Basically, took the envelope from the Bronx to Mount Vernon, walked into a police sting operation. 20 undercovers came out of nowhere, placed me under arrest. I did everything I could do wrong, and I wound up being sentenced to 2 15-year-to-life terms.
So you spent 12 years in Sing Sing.
Sing Sing, yes. And the only way I got out is by Governor George Pataki of New York State granting me executive clemency based on my art. One night I was sitting in my cell after 3 years, picked up a mirror, looked in the mirror, saw that an individual was going to spend the most productive years of his life in a cage, picked up a canvas and I painted the self-portrait, 15 to Life, I named it, and it wound up at the Whitney Museum of American Art a couple of years later, and I got a lot of publicity on my case, and that's how the governor found out about my case, and he granted me executive clemency.
That's amazing. So tell our viewers why you did not deserve to be in prison for 15 years to life sentences for kind of being the middleman and carrying $500 worth of cocaine.
Well, I think that, maybe I deserve some type of time, but not 15 years. It was an unbelievable nightmare experience for me. I think that by Obama, President Obama now granting these clemencies to these nonviolent drug offenders, it shows an emphasis on how the system is broken, where people are placed in prison for many, many years for nonviolent drug crimes. It's a waste of human life, a waste of valuable tax dollars that could be better spent for needy communities to put shoes on shoeless children. So I think that President Obama is doing the right thing, and hopefully he'll fix this broken system.
You were like a tiny, teeny little fish, right? Right?
Tiny.
Right.
A guppy.
You're a guppy, okay. And I'm just going to because the Washington Post has some interesting statistics that kind of illustrate what you just said. Since 1980, the prison population has more than quadrupled. To put that into perspective, that means 1 out of every 100 adults is locked up. And take a look at these other numbers too. The average cost for an inmate at a minimum security facility is about $21,000 per year. The average cost per year at a maximum security facility is about $33,000. So when you put it in economic terms like that, you could see that you're right, that we're spending all of this money incarcerating people that's not going to win the drug war, right?
Right.
What should have been done What should your punishment have been? What could have helped you more than being locked away
Well,
for 12
I think
years?
maybe a probation, I needed a wake-up call, not to be thrown in a cage for 15 years. I think that many Americans make mistakes in their life, and they wind up in prison, and they need second chances. I think the president is right to give an opportunity to individuals that have made mistakes in their life, and they need a second chance, a chance to be reunited with their families and to become productive taxpaying citizens. I'm hoping that governors of states follow the lead of President Obama and use their clemency pardon powers more to release people. There's one case in Louisiana, a case of Bernard Noble, a Louisiana man doing 13 years for the possession of 2 joints. So this is a crazy system. It needs to be fixed.
Anthony Papa, thank you so much for being with me this morning. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.